Welcome to Midnight Horrors. Dive into chilling tales and dark mysteries. Subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Story 1: The Curse of the Superstition Mountains. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old avid outdoorsman, Sam decided to embark on a solo night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. The mountains are infamous for the numerous and unexplained deaths that have occurred there, earning them their ominous name. Despite the warnings and the area's dark history, Sam, familiar with the terrain, decided to take on the challenge alone after his friend backed out at the last minute. Sam had planned to start his hike early to maximize daylight, but unforeseen circumstances delayed him, and he didn't reach the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. By then, the sun was already setting, and Sam knew he was cutting it close. Nevertheless, he decided to push on, hoping to reach a suitable campsite before nightfall. The trail was treacherous, winding through a canyon with steep drop-offs, and soon darkness enveloped the mountains. Sam's only light came from his flashlight, casting eerie shadows on the rocks around him. As he walked, the silence of the desert night settled in. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots on the gravel and the occasional rustle of wind through the bushes. But as he reached a clearing surrounded by pine trees, a sudden sense of unease washed over him. The clearing seemed oddly quiet. Ignoring the feeling, he set up camp, stringing a tarp between the trees and starting a small fire. As the flames flickered, casting long shadows round the clearing, Sam cracked open a can of beans, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. As Sam sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He scanned the tree line, but the fire's light limited his visibility at just a few feet around him. Then, out of nowhere, a small rock the size of a marble landed at his feet. Startled, Sam looked around but saw nothing. His heart raced as he tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was an animal or rock that had fallen from a tree, he thought, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. For the next 15 minutes, Sam sat on edge, scanning the darkness around him, but nothing else happened. Convincing himself that it was just his imagination, he climbed into his sleeping bag and tried to sleep. But a couple of hours later, he was jolted awake by the same overwhelming sense of dread. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of rustling leaves, as if someone or something was moving through the forest about 30 or 40 meters away. Sam lay still, listening intently, trying to determine if the footsteps were coming closer or moving away. Eventually, the sounds faded, and he tried to calm himself. Just to be safe, he reached for his flashlight, which he had left by his side, but it was gone. Panic set in as he realized that someone or something had been close enough to take his flashlight while he slept. He jumped out of his sleeping bag, ducked out from under the tarp, and frantically searched for the light. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw his flashlight lying on the ground about 10 meters away, in the direction of the rustling sounds. His blood ran cold as he realized that whatever had taken the flashlight had been right next to him. The thought of retrieving it made him nauseous, and he knew it was a trap, a lure to draw him away from the safety of his campfire. Determined not to fall into the trap, Sam stoked the fire, making it as big as possible, and stood in the middle of the campsite, clutching his knife. For the next few hours, he heard footsteps approaching and retreating, always staying just outside the circle of light. As the fire began to die down around 3 a.m., the footsteps came closer, stopping just a few meters away, behind the thickest group of trees. Sam stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, as he waited for whatever was out there to make its move. For 2 agonizing hours, Sam stood guard, staring into the darkness, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking just out of sight. But just as the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, the footsteps suddenly retreated, disappearing into the forest. When the sun finally rose, Sam quickly packed up his gear and fled the mountains, not daring to look back. Sam drove nonstop for miles, only stopping at a gas station to collect himself. But as he stepped out of the car, he noticed something written in the dust on the back window: "Sleep well." The message sent chills down his spine, confirming his worst fears. Whatever had stalked him in the Superstition Mountains had followed him all the way to his car. To this day, Sam doesn't know what was out there that night, but he's certain that it wasn't human. Story 2. The Whispering Pines. In the summer of 2018, a group of college friends decided to take a trip to a remote cabin in the woods of northern Maine. The cabin was surrounded by dense pine forests, known locally as the Whispering Pines, a place that locals avoided due to strange stories of eerie whispers and unexplained disappearances. The group, however, saw it as the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected, and by the time they arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin itself was old and weathered, with peeling paint and windows covered in grime, but the inside was cozy enough, with a wood stove, old furniture, and a stack of firewood. The group quickly settled in, eager to start their weekend of relaxation. That first night, they built a fire in the stove, cooked dinner, and shared stories by the fireplace. But as the night wore on, they began to notice something strange. The wind outside picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. But beneath the sound of the wind, they could hear faint whispers. At first, they thought it was just the wind playing tricks on them, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from the forest itself. The next day, the group decided to explore the surrounding forest. They hiked along a narrow trail that wound through the trees, but the further they went, the more uneasy they felt. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching their every move. As they moved deeper into the graveyard, the whispers became clearer, almost as if they were forming words. The trees around them seemed to close in, the branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out. Suddenly, Sarah cried out, saying she heard someone calling her name. The group froze, listening intently, and then they all heard it, Sarah's name being a whisper from the darkness, and a voice that wasn't hers. Panic set in as the group realized they were no longer alone. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping and echoing through the trees. They quickly turned back, but the forest seemed different. The path they had taken now unfamiliar and twisted. The whispers followed them, relentless as they tried to find their way back to the cabin. The group finally reached the cabin just as the sun began to set. The whispers outside grew louder, almost angry, as if the forest was trying to push them out. They barricaded themselves inside, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. That night, the whispers continued, echoing around the cabin, keeping them awake with fear. As dawn approached, the whispers suddenly stopped, and the forest fell silent. Taking this as their chance, the group quickly packed up and fled, not daring to look back. As they drove away, they noticed the trees swaying in the wind, as if the forest itself was watching them leave. The friends never returned to the Whispering Pines, and the experience left them shaken. They later learned that the graveyard they had stumbled upon was the final resting place of a family who had mysteriously disappeared in the 1800s. The locals believed that their spirits still haunted the forest, their whispers luring in unsuspecting victims. To this day, the friends are haunted by the memory of those whispers, and they warn others to stay far away from the Whispering Pines. Story 3. The Shadow of Devil's Creek. In the fall of 2015, a small group of hikers set out on an expedition to explore Devil's Creek, a remote and rugged area deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The place was known for its dangerous terrain and was named after the eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the creek at dusk. Despite the ominous reputation, the group was eager to experience the wilderness. The hike to Devil's Creek was grueling, with steep inclines and narrow paths that forced the group to tread carefully. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. As they descended into the valley where the creek flowed, the atmosphere grew heavier, and a sense of unease began to settle over them. When they reached the creek, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the water. The group set up camp by the creek, eager to rest after the long hike. As night fell, they sat around the campfire, listening to the sound of the water flowing and the distant calls of night creatures. But as the fire burned low, they began to notice something strange. The shadows along the creek seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing in the dim light. As the night wore on, the group couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows along the creek grew more pronounced, and the air became colder, filled with an unnatural chill. One of the hikers, a man named Tom, decided to investigate, thinking that maybe the shadows were just an optical illusion caused by the firelight. But as he approached the water's edge, the shadows seemed to converge, forming a dark, indistinct figure that stood across the creek, watching him. Tom froze, unable to move, as the figure slowly began to approach, its form barely visible in the darkness. The other hikers, noticing Tom's sudden stillness, called out to him, but he couldn't respond. He was paralyzed with fear, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure. It wasn't until one of the others grabbed him by the shoulder that he snapped out of it and stumbled back to the campfire. The group gathered around the fire, their nerves on edge, as Tom recounted what he had seen. No one could explain it, but they all agreed that something wasn't right. As they talked, the shadows around them seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if the forest itself was closing in. The fire flickered, casting eerie light on the trees, and in the darkness they could hear the faint sound of footsteps moving through the woods. Panic set in as the shadows began to shift, taking on forms that seemed almost human, but not quite. The hikers backed away from the fire, their eyes darting around the campsite, trying to locate the source of the footsteps. But no matter where they looked, the shadows were always just out of reach, moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. Realizing that they were in danger, the group decided to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. But as they extinguished the fire and prepared to hike out, the shadows began to move closer, their forms becoming more distinct. The hikers could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on them, the air thick with fear and dread. They hurried along the narrow path, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness, as the shadows followed them, always just out of sight. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was following them was getting closer. Desperation set in, and they began to run, stumbling over roots and rocks in their haste to escape. As they reached the edge of the valley, the shadows suddenly stopped, as if they were bound to the creek. The hikers didn't stop to question their luck. They continued running until they reached their car, exhausted and terrified. They never spoke of what they had experienced at Devil's Creek, but the memory of the shadows haunted them. It seems there was an issue with the content provided. To continue crafting the stories and generating the dolly prompts, I would need more specific details or any text that you would like me to base the stories on. If you can provide more context or upload the necessary details, I'll be able to proceed with creating the next story and its corresponding prompts. Story for The Lost Trail of Willow Creek. In the fall of 2017, the seasoned hikers Lucy and Mark decided to explore a remote section of the Cascade Mountains known for its stunning views and challenging trails. Their chosen path led them to Willow Creek, a rarely traveled trail deep in the forest. The trail was rumored to be haunted, with many locals warning against hiking there after dark due to strange occurrences and disappearances. The hike began early in the morning, with the crisp autumn air filling their lungs. The trail was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest of towering pines and maples. As they walked, the golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a warm glow on the path ahead. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, and the two hikers felt invigorated by the beauty around them. As the day wore on, they reached a point where the trail split into two. The map indicated that both paths would lead to Willow Creek, but one was shorter and steeper, while the other was longer but more gradual. Eager to reach the creek before nightfall, they chose the shorter, steeper path. However, as they continued, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush thickened, making it harder to see the trail ahead. As they descended deeper into the forest, the sunlight began to fade, and the atmosphere grew colder. The forest, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed ominous and foreboding. The birds had stopped singing, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. Lucy and Mark noticed strange markings on the tree's deep gouges that looked as if they had been made by something with sharp claws. The unease grew as they found themselves in a dense part of the forest where the trees were so thick that barely any light penetrated through. The trail became harder to follow, and the feeling of being watched crept over them. Mark suggested turning back, but Lucy, determined to reach the creek, insisted they push on. The whispers of doubt grew louder in their minds, but they pressed forward, not realizing they were walking into a trap. As dusk settled in, they finally reached Willow Creek, but instead of the serene, babbling brook they had expected, they found a creek shrouded in mist, with the water dark and still. The atmosphere was heavy, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water from the rocks. As they set up camp, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As night fell, they sat by the fire, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But as the fire crackled, they heard something low, guttural growls coming from the forest. They grabbed their flashlights and shone them into the darkness, but the beams of light seemed to be swallowed by the trees. The growls grew louder, closer, and suddenly the fire was extinguished as if by an unseen hand. Panic set in as the darkness closed in around them. The growls were now all around, echoing through the trees, and then they saw it, the glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness, unblinking and full of malice. The creature was large and shadowy, its form indistinct but terrifying. It moved closer, its growls rumbling through the forest like distant thunder. Lucy and Mark didn't wait to see what the creature was. They grabbed their packs and ran, the sound of the creature's footsteps thundering behind them. The forest seemed to come alive, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap them. The trail they had followed so carefully was now gone, replaced by a maze of roots and branches that slowed their escape. The creature's growls were right behind them, its breath hot on their necks. They stumbled and fell, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Just when they thought they would be caught, they burst out of the forest and into a clearing where the moonlight shone down, illuminating a small, abandoned cabin. They scrambled inside, barricading the door with whatever they could find. Inside the cabin, they huddled together, trying to catch their breath. The creature circled the cabin, its growls reverberating through the wooden walls. The hours dragged on, and just before dawn, the growling stopped. They waited, hearts pounding, until the first light of day crept through the cracks in the cabin walls. As the sun rose, Lucy and Mark cautiously exited the cabin, only to find the forest silent and still. There was no sign of the creature, but the memory of those glowing eyes haunted them as they made their way back to the main trail. They never spoke of what happened that night, but both knew they had encountered something beyond the natural world. The lost trail of Willow Creek was a place they vowed never to return to, a place where the boundary between our world and the unknown was dangerously thin. Thank you so much for watching. We hope these stories gave you chills and kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our spine-chilling content. Your support helps us continue bringing you more terrifying tales. Stay tuned for more, and as always, stay safe out there.